But we're so pleased to have Marianne Bates from California Cradle-to-Career Data System and Matt Berry from the Kentucky Center for Statistics, KY Stats. We're going to have some wonderful state updates from my colleague Ted, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap up and talk about next steps. Most importantly, as we get started, I wanted to share that statewide longitudinal data systems, or P20W systems, connect individual data over time and across sectors, including early childhood, post-secondary, and workforce, which makes it possible to glean insights about the entire education to workforce journey. Oh, there we go. That's what I wanted to go. Our DQC team members that are talking with us today are Brennan McMahon-Parton, our Vice President of State Policy and Advocacy here at the Data Quality Campaign, and Ted Welsh, the Senior Associate for Policy and Advocacy here at the Data Quality Campaign. You'll hear from Ted a little bit later, but I'm going to hand the mic over to Brennan for now while I get the chat figured out. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Angela. I'm so intrigued to hear what people's summer favorites are. So I'm looking forward to the chat. And I will say too, please, now that we know that at least some people figured out the Q&A, please feel free to drop things in, clarifying or other questions as we go through the presentation. We'll try to make sure we get to everybody's point, and if not, have the opportunity to follow up with you after. As Angela said, I'm Brennan McMahon-Parton. I'm the Vice President of State Policy and Advocacy here at DQC. And I've been here working on state policies to make data work for people for a really long time. And we have talked about so many different approaches to improving data access and use at DQC. We focused on data literacy, we focused on report cards, dashboards, tools, resources, so many things that absolutely matter. But I have to say, excuse me, the reason you're here listening to us talk about data governance today is because we have found, and we tried not to find this, I will say, that legislating high quality cross sector data governance is one of the best ways to advance your data ecosystem, to sustain the quality and access to your data. So we always call it an administrative solution to an administrative problem, but it is the pathway to solving a lot of the other kinds of data issues that you may be experiencing in your state. So, Angela, I think I'm, yes, asking you to advance my slides. Thank you. So, as I said, this is the most important step that states can take. I know that not everybody loves to hear that there needs to be a legislative approach. And again, we tried to not get there. Oh, there's other ways. You can do executive order, you can do it administratively, and that's all true. But legislation with those vehicles for fiscal notes, with those vehicles for pulling people from different sectors together, from different agencies together, has proven to be the most sustainable approach. And you're going to be hearing, as Angela said, from two states, Kentucky and California, who we feature often and for good reason, today, talking about what their experience is with that. So going on to the next slide, please. Um, I'm making my points before the slides show up. I apologize, but this cross-agency data governance is the best way for state leaders to ensure that linked data systems serve people across the state. We see too often that data systems can fade into the background, right? It can be just a project. It can be a series of behind-the-scenes data sharing agreements, maybe to get a certain thing done. But having these decision makers sitting at a shared table in the sunshine, and in states we're seeing this over long term and nearer term in Kentucky and in California, is the best way to push forward and make sure that those data systems serve people. Next slide, please, Angela. So just governance and practice, just a little bit more about what we're talking about here. If you have worked on state data or know things about SLDSs or W data systems, you've heard this term governance. And I like to talk about there's lowercase g and capital G governance. If you have any sort of data system, any sort of data sharing going on in your state, which you do, it's not an if, then you absolutely have what I call lowercase g governance in place. And it's essential, right? It's the rules of the road for how that data is coming together. What are the business rules? What are the privacy considerations? This is essential. This is good practice. I'm not saying don't do that. What we're saying is that what needs to sit on top of this is policies that define the roles and responsibilities across policy leadership. So those senior leaders within agencies for that cross-agency. So you're getting at that policy leadership, that cross-agency implementation and technical expertise. And together, these components create the foundation for that leadership level cross-agency data governance. Thank you, Angela. Nope, that was the perfect segue to the governance pyramid. Excuse me. This will look familiar to you again if you've dug into this topic before. I like to give credit to our colleagues at NCES for originating a version of this pyramid, but we've updated it to reflect actually the states that you're going to hear from today. Um, So at the top, you're going to have that SLDS governing board that's going to consist of at least the agency heads from the contributing agencies. This is about policy alignment. It's about setting vision. It's these are our priorities in workforce. These are our priorities in education. What are our priorities as statewide? And how is a data system supporting answering those questions? How is a research agenda supporting answering those questions? In that core center of the pyramid here is the statewide longitudinal data system managing entity, administrative entity, office, whatever you may want to call it, an independent sitter office charged with delivering on the vision of the SLDS. This is important to note that what we're saying is it's not just an office within one of the contributing agencies, and we can get into the technicalities of that, because the core is that managing entity is responsible to the board, not the commissioner or the secretary of any one of the contributing agencies. And finally, these content and technical experts, experts from across source systems and agencies, and maybe even outside researchers, things like that, that provide advice or come together to get work done. And I will note out too that we've got this concept of external groups that might be providing their feedback, working with stakeholder engagement at all levels of this pyramid, helping you make sure that data is meeting the needs of people. Our research request process is working for the people we want access to the data. Is this tool useful to the people that we want to use it? So it's that push and pull between the leaders internally who need to make the system happen and making sure that they're hearing from folks outside of the government as well. Thanks, Angela. I think she's saying the chat is working. Yay. On to the next. So you hopefully got in your inbox today that we released Data Governance 101, where we break down, best practices of codified cross-agency data governance at the state level. So I'm going to be going through 4 components that you can read in more detail in our paper that came out today. So starting with first, and I'm mentioning this, the governing board includes leaders from all the data contributing agencies. So at the bare minimum, if you have a P20W education through post-secondary and workforce system, you would expect to see the leaders of those agencies, whatever that looks like in your state, who are bringing data together into this P20W data system, sitting at a shared table. And then this external groups piece, and Marianne, I suspect we'll talk about a bit about this, but having folks from outside of those agencies, so that could mean intragovernmental actors, maybe you want to put a legislator on your board, but also folks outside of those state agencies, superintendent of a local school district, a researcher, someone focused on ethics or equity. Depending on what the priorities are of your state, you can use voices outside of those agencies to round out the composition of your board. Going on to the next. The governing board has authority over the SLDS's managing entity. Again, I'm talking about things that are happening in statute. That's how we're making this possible, right? And I mentioned this a bit before on the pyramid slide, is that we want to make sure that that entity, that executive director, is not just beholden to any one of the commissioners or secretaries sitting on the board. Of course, we need those relationships and that communication, that open dialogue, but that their boss, if you will, is the board, just like the CEO of DQC's boss is our board, right? Same sort of in practice here. Going on to the next. Um, the governing board oversees the executive director, the SLDS's executive director. Again, just as I was saying, that director's boss, the person in charge of that center, is working directly with the board. Go on next, Angela. I'm going to let our panelists put the most meat on this bone. And component 4, the purpose of the system is clear and the governing board has a clearly defined charge and authority. So we like to see sort of a 1-2 punch in policy that says, this is our statewide longitudinal data system. We're establishing it, funding it, ensuring it exists, and we're saying this is what it's for. So recent examples in statute, for instance, Alabama came in through this front door focused on apprenticeship and workforce outcomes. In Colorado, they were talking about the outcomes of higher education in their state, right? And so their system is established. And in Maryland, it's about understanding student success in K-12 in their statute, right? Those can evolve and change over time, of course. But what we want to say is this system doesn't exist just to be a data system. It's for something. It's for helping us understand outcomes in the state. This managing entity is going to deliver on that, and the board is going to make sure that that system is aligned to the vision that we've laid out here. Moving on. So, like I said, that was my overview on best practices that we've seen. We've seen it work best in statute. There are, of course, many lessons learned on how to get that done and what it means like in practice. I hope you will all dig in on our new paper that came out today. And I'm going to turn back to Angela to tee up our state leaders.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Brennan. And apologies, everyone, for the momentary panic I experienced as I was trying to get the chat enabled. Please feel free to drop in the chat your favorite summer sweet treat as we get started. But I am going to transition over to our Dr. Matt Berry, who has joined us from KY Stats. Matt started at KY Stats as the organization's research director, but he has been the executive director there since March 2023. We are so grateful to have you speak with us, Matt. I'm going to turn it over to you. I will get your slides. There's your smiling face, everyone. This is Matt Berry, and I'll turn it over to you, Matt.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thank you all for inviting me to be here and giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about our experience in Kentucky. So it's hard to do this presentation without a bunch of legislative language on the slide. So apologies for just a bunch of text, but on these slides. But I don't know how to make that into pictures. So we'll just all have to deal with it. I'll try to paint a picture with words. I will also say that a lot of this, right up front, this has been done in Kentucky over, now getting close to a 15-year period, and really longer, right? Because even when you talk about sort of originating statute or executive orders, there's clearly groundwork done prior to that. I mentioned that just because we have learned a lot of lessons over that time, and I think that I can speak to the sustainability and the effect on sustainability of these efforts, but also just to mention that if there are folks on the call that are maybe newer in this process, you can get there. It may take a long time, but I think that these are some foundational principles. And thanks, Brennan, for teeing up sort of what you all are seeing across the nation and as a field, because I think that's really helpful. And I think you'll see some of that here in what I'm talking about in Kentucky, but maybe we have our own spin on it too, so it's not always the same. And then the last note I'll make is that other people did all of this. As Angela said, I've been here since 2023 as the executive director. So I'm just really been here trying not to mess up the good work my predecessors did. So that's enough sort of background. Let me kind of go through. There are a few really key pieces of legislation that I think helped to establish our governance as an agency. And for those of you who may have been in a room where I've spoken before, and if you have to hear me more than once, I'm so sorry that that's happening to you, but here we are again. You've probably heard me say something along the lines of, if I'm asked what some of the key elements to Kentucky Stats, success, whatever level of success we've had, but certainly our sustainability has been, it is our governance structure. So I really firmly believe, and I would say this on a call that had nothing to do with this as a topic, I really firmly believe this is one of our absolute primary foundational wins and keys to sustainability. So I do want to dig in a little bit to what I think has helped. Brennan, I think you mentioned both executive orders and statute as ways into this. We've seen both in Kentucky, although in short order. So there was work prior to 2012 on this. We really kind of started as a grant with the primary investigator and a couple of kind of part-time staffers, or maybe even a couple of full-time staffers. But in 2012, there's an executive order establishing this, what would become at that point the P20 Data Collaborative, then transitioned into the Kentucky Center for Education and Workforce Statistics, and now KY Stats. the statute that I want, or the pieces of legislation that I want to talk about really were 2013 and beyond. So 2013, and you can see the legislation written there, is really when KY Stats was formed as an agency. So just to highlight a few of the things that that piece of legislation did, and I want to talk about a couple of others, but it really outlined our duties in terms of de-identification of personally identifiable data, conducting research and evaluation, requirements for agencies to be providing data, and then sort of broadly speaking, working with other public agencies to collect data and provide them into the what we refer to as the KLDS, or the Kentucky Longitudinal Data System. On the next slide, you can see a couple of other pieces of or duties, I should say, which were outlined in that piece of legislation. These are all pretty, you're probably noticing already, but these are all pretty big and broad. It's sort of directional. It's not as specific as maybe I think some other pieces of legislation that I've seen, but I think it outlined duties, which I think was a good place to start. So obviously linking data from multiple sources, administrating regulations necessary for the system administration, data quality standards, and then there's everyone's favorite FERPA there at the bottom. I highlighted the next piece of legislation that I want to really talk about and that I think is pretty pertinent to our conversation, which is the establishment of the board. So we still operate under this structure as an agency. And Brennan, I think you mentioned a couple of, or at least alluded to this. I would say that in terms of what you mentioned as best practices, that's pretty similarly, or that's pretty well aligned, I should say, to how we operate and are structured. So we have in this legislation in 2013 established, we have a board consisting of 5 individuals. The commissioner of the Department of Education, which is our K-12 organization, the secretary of the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, which is sort of our HHS equivalent, the president of the Kentucky on Council on Post-Secondary Education, which is we refer to as CPE, is our SHEO agency, or higher ed coordinating board, and the secretary of the Education and Labor Cabinet, and the CEO of the Kentucky Higher Education Assistance Authority, which is they do more than this, but they're our state's financial aid arm, basically. So that's the board which was established in statute. The Education and Labor Cabinet secretary is our chair, remains our chair. And we, as an agency, are administratively attached to the Education and Labor Cabinet. I believe the language is attached to the Secretary's Office for administrative purposes only. So it provides a level of independence for us. Again, as you mentioned, Brendan, I report, and my staff report into the board. The board, if we go to the next slide, the board is also charged with oversight of the organization, development, helping to develop a research agenda, and so on. So sort of what you would think of traditionally as a board. I will mention too, related to this, even though I didn't add this specifically into the slides. There's another piece of legislation which is also related to our board, but the duties of the organization itself, or the agency itself, which outlines sort of who the primary data sharing agencies will be. It also establishes data ownership will remain with the providing agency. It puts accuracy on, or the responsibility for accuracy on the data owners as well. So within these foundational pieces of legislation, not only is the organization and the governance of the organization being established, but also the way in which data will be shared, who is responsible for accuracy and ownership of the data, and which agencies are required to be shared. There is also, so one of the things I think is good about these founding pieces of legislation is there is some specificity, but then there is some sort of forward-looking flexibility for us to grow and evolve over time. So we are afforded opportunities to find funding from multiple sources within this statute. So we're able to be funded through state appropriation, federal grants, user fees, and any other grants or contributions from public agencies or other entities. So that gives us a lot of flexibility there. It also outlines the specific agencies which will contribute data, but then also gives us, latitude for receiving data from other agencies within the Education and Labor Cabinet to which we're attached, but also other public agencies and other private or parochial educational institutions throughout the state or other private entities through which we are with whom we are engaged, I should say. So again, there is a lot of specificity, which I think is really important, but some latitude for growth, which I think has been really helpful for us in terms of our evolution. I think on the next slide, I have a visual, just because I was feeling bad. I think Brandon, I'm doing the same thing you did. I got ahead of myself there, but because I was feeling bad a little bit about all of the words, here's just a sort of a visual of our board. I will say, just as a little bit of insight, we have had conversations over the last several years. They probably predate me too. I can't imagine it's unique to the last few years, around whether we should revisit adding agencies and individuals to our board. We have not done so. There's not been sort of a driving rationale. It's really been more of a, continuous revisiting of, is this still the best structure? Not that we would change, but should we add? Would that help us? There's been no, tangible action to that, but I just mentioned just to say, one, I think it's good to sort of evaluate this, and then two, on an ongoing basis, and then two, this could change in the future as well if folks thought that would behoove the organization. And then on the next slide, just what I wanted to show here is relative to or sort of related to what I was just mentioning. This is a snapshot of the agencies providing data into our system today. And this is not actually completely exhaustive, so there's some more in there. But I wanted to just sort of show the breadth of the system, which I think is great, but also just to mention that I think there's opportunity for what I was just saying, which is, could expansion of the board at some point behoove us? I don't know whether it will or not, but I think it's something for us to consider moving forward. And the reason I think it's valuable to consider is because the structure itself of having the primary agencies with whom we are from whom we are to receive data has been so valuable to us. And so if we want to strengthen relationships or build new relationships, that might be an avenue by which we do that moving forward in the future. But that's a little bit of to be determined. And I think I've got maybe just one more slide to show off in terms of, because we like to show off a little bit, get the opportunity to talk to folks, just to show kind of the breadth of the agency itself. So, if you think back to the 2013 timeframe when these pieces of legislation were enacted or signed into law, really this would have been much smaller in terms of the number of active elements. We're over 6,000 now, file types close to 200, and then really what I love is the number of agencies and sources from which we receive data. We want that to keep growing. Hopefully, if I do this again in 2 or 3 years, that's 40 agencies or something like that. But I think I put this up here in all seriousness just as a testament to, I think this is in no small part a result of those foundational decisions around governance, both structurally and strategically, how we operate and the vehicles through which we operate. So that's a pretty quick overview. Hopefully it gives you some insight into how we've gotten where we are. And I think we might have some opportunity later to answer questions. And if so, I'd be happy to.
Matt, I do have 2 quick questions for you from the chat or from the Q&A. First was about how you got arrangements with different agencies, in particular with automotive and CompTIA certification companies.
So I'm not totally sure that I understand that question, and just the how part. So let me answer it broadly, but I'm just copying to the fact that this is like a vague answer, and maybe I'm not meaning to be. But what I think anytime that we have gained a new data source, what has typically happened is one of two things. Number one happens less frequently. An agency reaches out to us and they have some specific set of questions and they would really like to provide us data so that we can give them some good information back. That happens more and more over time, but in the early days, less frequently. What I think is more frequent, has happened more frequently, is I think in the early days of KY Stats, they did a really great job of demonstrating the potential and the value very quickly and very frequently. So there was some tangible output from the system, so folks were able to see what could be done. As that was occurring, there were constant conversations and engagement of potential partners around if we were to receive data from, driver's license data as an example. I think you mentioned that because I can't quite see the chat, so I'm just trying to go off memory. We would be able to do these three or four things, and that would provide value to you in these ways. And what we have found is framing the conversation like that, it doesn't happen really, really quickly because there's a lot to figure out in terms of data sharing and MOUs and and all that type of thing. But there, at least here in Kentucky, that's been a pretty helpful way to approach it. I think one thing I tell our team, I think I help our team remember when we're going about these conversations, and I think is really helpful too, since most of us are data folks. You know, try to remember a time when a researcher just asked for K-12 data, because that happens, right? I would really like the K-12 data. Well, that's a lot. And I don't know what the value is there. Like, what are we working on? So I really, really, really think it's critical that these asks are well structured, that they're not um, out of balance in terms of scale, that you're asking for a specific thing to integrate into your system for a specific purpose, and that the last thing that I think is really critical is that there's a really clear and demonstrable value to engaging in the sharing. Because I think everyone sees this sort of general good, but everyone also has a thousand things that they're trying to accomplish. So if there's not going to be some value, I think it's a lot harder.
Matt, you could not have had a better segue into this last question I have for you, which is how do you measure the impact on education and employment outcomes, and how can states measure success in these contexts?
Yeah, so I assume that's relative to a longitudinal data system, like sort of how we measure value. I think that's a little trickier. We measure output to be sure, and I think that we use a lot of our output metrics as a proxy for value. But I think there are some safe assumptions. So yeah, we measure the number of reports, the number of data requests, the number of external stakeholder engagements. We always have a sense and track, how many times we're asked by the legislature or the governor's office for things. So I think for us, and we track sort of usage of our publicly available tools. Um, so what I think we have a pretty good sense of is the demand for our product. And I think that approximates value, at least in our minds. Of course, we have a qualitative sense of sort of our standing in the Commonwealth. I think we are pretty clearly seen as a valuable resource, as a trusted partner, as a source of reliable data and information, which is not going to be tainted by our opinion or sort of a political slant. So I think that the combination of those two things is sort of how we assess that. But I can't sit here and say that we sort of have a dashboard of metrics which says that this is exactly how we measure that.
That's fair. But it is really helpful to have your perspective on that, and really appreciate you sharing all of that about KY Stats and all of the cool work that you all are doing and the value of governance to the system. I am going to move now to our wonderful colleague, Marianne Bates at the California Cradle-to-Career data system. Marianne is the executive director of the system and the inaugural director of the system who came on in 2021 as the system was getting up and running. So Marianne, so delighted to have you join us. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. And as you just mentioned, California is relatively new to this space. I've been in this role now for 4 years, and so it's been a real honor to be able to learn from Kentucky and from other states, and to learn together with DQC as we get this work going. So if we can go to the next slide. Like Matt, even when I'm not on a webinar that DQC is hosting with the word governance in the title, I talk about governance and decision making a lot. And it's fun to talk about, modern technology and having a modern tech stack and some of the really fun um, technological innovations that have been at the foundation of our work. But I think the most important aspect of the work is the decision making and the shared decision making that we have. So in California, the data system is a whole of government effort. It's been championed by the governor, by the legislature, by the state's education and workforce leaders, and crucially, by researchers, advocates, and practitioners outside of state government as well. And I'll talk more about how they have a seat at the table too. Our work is grounded in inclusive decision making and transparency. We do this work in a fishbowl, some of that literally with our open public meetings, and also in spirit as we try to be very transparent about the data we're bringing together and why we're doing that. And our key identity, which is in the statute that established us, is to be a neutral source of trusted information. Next slide. So the data set that we are bringing together is the foundation for how the public can then access that information and how our partners can access it in three different ways. One is through dashboards. So you can see small screenshots of one of our dashboards here, intuitive, easy for people to play with on our website. We also have what we call our query builder. Think of that as essentially public use flat file CSV files so that people can take the same data that powers the dashboard, create their own visualizations from it. And then we're currently piloting a research request process where in the future, researchers and our data partners will be able to request access to the underlying data to work within a secure enclave. Slide. So what data are we bringing together? And this data goes across K-12 education, higher education, workforce and earnings data, so job training data, earnings data, and then the take-up of social services like SNAP or Medicaid, for example. And you can see in California, we have a lot of entities in this space. So when I talk about the size of our board, I want you to see that as a reflection of the fairly fragmented K-12 and higher education landscape we have in California with lots of different and some very independent entities who all needed to be at the table. But the logos you see on the screen are the ones who are currently submitting data to the data system. Next slide. When we got going, our first data submission happened in the fall of 2023. We had 8 data providers submit data in that first round, which is a large number to coordinate all at once and to have 8 different departments and agencies submitting data all at once. This past spring, in our annual data ingestion, we doubled that. So we have 16 entities submitting data, and we just recently put out a blog that tells the story of that. But the foundation of this was really the trust and transparency that's baked into how we're operating, a very strong governance structure, and critically, one stable legal agreement that hasn't changed since it was initially signed in May of 2022. Next slide. All right, so I want to now walk you through one example, and this is the largest expansion of the data system to date. It was bringing in a bunch of new job training and apprenticeship data and earnings data, and how that was set in motion via one 45-minute item at the Cradle-to-Career Governing Board last year. Next slide. So what were the necessary ingredients? Critically, governance, and that's a big word. I basically think of that as who gets to make which decisions about the data and how it's used. Who gets to make the decisions, and do you have written clarity on that? And then the second point, and this is really important, is that you have to start with a specific why. You have to have a reason for why the data needs to be brought together. You can call that a use case, you can call it a learning agenda, but critically, it is not a bunch of data enthusiasts or nerds sitting in a room saying, wouldn't it be great to bring the data together because then the data would be together, right? You have to have a clear reason for what you can't get done or the questions you cannot answer unless these data are brought together and linked. And that needs to be the starting point for everything. And then critically, we have an approach of listening first and then building. Next slide. So what does this governance look like in practice? I've mentioned the legislation. We had legislation both to kick off a planning process and then to establish our office. We have legal agreements. We even have documents that our governing board has publicly available on how they make decisions. That provides clarity when we say, should the data system bring on a new department? Or should new data elements be added? Or should old data elements be changed? We have a clear process for what the governing board vote needs to be, what our data providers who maintain ownership of the data we link on their behalf, what their role is, and what our office's authority is. And that going slow initially has really enabled us to then be nimble and faster in an ongoing way. I want to highlight the circles on the right. So I report to a governing board, more on that in a moment. In addition, there are also in statute 2 advisory boards, one focused on data and tools, one focused on community engagement. Each one has 16 public individuals. People apply for these. We get over 100 applications every time we open the door to new applications here. So there's a lot of public engagement. And that's important because it means that there's always a bit of a push and a pull between the public asking for more and what our data providers in our office have capacity to do. The last thing I'll just mention, the overarching legal agreements are really important. As we've added new data providers or added new data points, we haven't had to re-execute those agreements with everyone. They were written in such a way that new signatures can be added, new data points can be added or updated without needing to start all over again, which has been critical. Next slide. All right, this 21-person governing board, don't try to read all of the tiny words here. Just note that the people in green, right, those are our data providers. So of the 21-person board I report to, roughly half are either directly or indirectly related to the data we receive. Again, that's because of the nature of the size of California and the nature of how our K-12 higher education and workforce programs are set up. The other half of the board, think of them as the users of the data system. So we have governor's appointees, we have assembly and senate appointees, we have an assembly member and a senator on the board, and they make decisions by a 2/3 majority vote of the members. So basically consensus. And what this means is we have a structured way for both the public who wants access to the insights from this data and the data providers who need to provide the data and maintain ownership and stewardship of it, coming together and taking votes together to advance the work. Next slide. So what did this look like for the workforce expansion specifically? So again, the new data that was involved here, we're talking about participation in workforce training programs, apprenticeship programs across the entire state. So the first step is that the governance and legal frameworks were in place. What you see here is a screenshot of the Cradle-to-Career Data System Act. Our legislation was pretty detailed and specific on the authority the board has, the authority the office has, and the authority the data providers continue to have. Next slide. And then the second part was starting with the why, right? Starting with a learning agenda. First, this came from Secretary Knox, who's our Secretary of Labor here in California. So the screenshot you see here is a memo that Secretary Knox sent to us where he outlined, here's why we want our new departments to join and these new data points to be added. And then it contained essentially a learning agenda, bullet point questions that they said they can't answer without having this data linked. So questions like, how do people in the workforce system do based on whether they receive job training compared to those who don't receive job training, right? That's a question that can only be answered when that job training participation data is linked with a bunch of the other data. So there was a strong why that was outlined in this memo. And then we had a very efficient public task force. They met on Zoom 3 times, refined these recommendations, and then made those recommendations to the governing board. Next slide. And then last May, we took a vote in our governing board meeting. You can see there's a picture of the Labor and Workforce Development Agency's department leadership smiling after a unanimous vote to add new departments. And there's about a total of about 150 data elements all told that were added to the data system through that vote. So that vote enabled the work to start, and then our teams work together on a replicable process of defining the file upload specifications and then working on the whole transmission of the data that then happened this spring. Next slide. And then critically, now we're at the really fun stage. This is a recent brainstorming session we had again with that department leadership, and we're working with them to say, now that you've submitted this data, as we link it, can we make it available in a secure enclave for your own learning, for your own reporting that you need to do with your departments, which happens in tandem with the tools that we then build for the public to touch and feel. Next slide. So again, just to wrap all of this, I think of governance as being written clarity on who makes which decisions about the data, and really the importance of starting with a specific use case and having a why for why the data needs to be brought together. And then making sure that user-centered design and listening to what people need comes before we build the dashboards or release data reports so that we're building what people will actually be able to use. All right, with that, I'm happy to turn it back over to DKC.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I did not mean to get ahead of myself, but I am so excited to introduce my wonderful colleague, Ted Welsh, who is going to share with us a little bit about governance legislation and give us a status update on where we're at. Ted, let me hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Angela, and thanks, Matt and Marianne, for sharing some of your state-specific context. I'll note that in California and Kentucky specifically, their SLDSs have really translated to real impact, and governance legislation is a key foundation for allowing that impact to become reality. Brennan led us with some of the key components of governance legislation. But if we're looking at just the kind of bare minimum, what we're looking for in terms of governing legislation for an SLDS, number one, the statute should establish a clear purpose for the system. Number two, it should define the governing body. And as Marianne alluded to, really who specifically is responsible for making decisions about the data. It should designate the entity or an entity responsible for managing the SLDS and ensure the system operates in alignment with its purpose and stated policy goals. A governing body can really ensure that that happens. You can go to the next slide, Angela. So as we consider that, here's our landscape of states today in terms of governance legislation. So the states in kind of that purplish shade are states that have active laws on the books governing cross-agency data or establishing cross-agency data governance. This really began early in kind of late aughts, early 2010s. Kentucky, Maryland, and Washington as the early adopters, and we've seen 9 new states establish cross-agency data governance. So any leaders in some of these blue states without legislated data governance can draw inspiration from any of the purple states based on the components that might relate most to their state-specific education and workforce goals, the political climate, and other contexts that might be of value. You'll notice that these states in purple, they all have active cross-agency data governance legislation, but they differ geographically, politically, by population size, physical size. There's plenty of difference among these states, but they all have great pieces of legislation. And another note is that these states in blue, just because they don't have governance legislation, does not mean they don't have an operational SLDS. But as Brennan noted, we've seen plenty of really great systems come and go as a result of political shifts or changing priorities or organizational restructuring and other factors. And without that cross-agency data governance, sustainability is not a guarantee. So having that governance legislation in place is what really allows these systems to endure from one administration to the next and over the course of those changing priorities. You can go to the next slide, Angela. So this year we have 3 states that are taking some major steps towards establishing and ensuring long-term sustainability for their systems. All 3 of these states have operational SLDSs and have had them for some time. Georgia and New Jersey have passed cross-agency data governance legislation that establishes a governing board, charges it with overseeing the SLDS, sets policies for data collection, privacy, and use, and identifies research questions. Ohio is making efforts to do the same. They have a bill that has passed the Senate a couple weeks ago and is working its way through the House. That bill wouldn't create specifically a governance body, but it would be a substantial step towards sustainability and include some key aspects of cross-agency data governance. So it's a bill that we at DQC are watching and excited about. So that's our update for 2026. I think I'll pass it to Brennan to discuss next steps for state leaders and close out the webinar.
Brendan, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but do you mind? I have a quick question in the chat for, I think, both Matt and Marianne, if we have just a minute for that. Matt, Marianne, here's the question that was put in chat. Can you talk about the efforts you made to change data collection systems, organizational culture, or otherwise address the fact that direct service staff may need data in a certain format that is different than is what is needed for evaluation?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. In some cases, what's needed for practical day-to-day operations is different from what's needed in a longitudinal data system. And in those cases, we've partnered with organizations who are doing that work. So for example, California Colleges.edu is the state's college and career planning platform. The data that a local counselor sees about her own students in her local district in that system is different from the kinds of data that's in a longitudinal data system. Similarly, we're partnering with partners on electronic transcripts, transmissions across the state, things that have to do with linking data, but is different from a state longitudinal data system. So sometimes the answer is that we work with partners. The other piece, in terms of kind of shifting organizational culture and how data is collected, I think something that's ongoing over time and why having a clear governance structure is really important. So, for example, when we release a dashboard, and people can't filter by what they'd like to filter because that's not how the data is collected. Our board meetings and our interactions with advocates and with the advisory boards is an opportunity for people to say, you know what, data should be collected in this way instead so that we can answer these other questions. So I see that as something that is going to need to be ongoing over time. And again, it can be driven forward by having all of the relevant partners together in one space through the governance structure for the SLDS, and then weigh the trade-offs and say, of the following 10 ideas we've heard from the public on how they'd like to see data collection at the state change, which ones have the highest potential impact, which ones are the most feasible to do in the short run, and that can be an ongoing conversation that we help foster.
I mean, as almost always, Marianne says it better than I can. So I really do just agree with every word that she just spoke. I would just add that I mentioned some of the things, some of the outputs we track. One of the reasons that we track external stakeholder engagements is because we've tried to, and this is to the culture question, we've tried to bake that into our process as firmly as we possibly can. So we don't, for us, we hold focus groups. We have at minimum annual meetings with our partners around just these issues, but typically we meet with them far more frequently than that. We've done intentional 6 months of stakeholder engagement in the Appalachian region of the state. So we really focus on that very, very strongly. I think the other thing I would say is, and Marianne said it too, we do work with our partners in terms of, the structure of submissions. The way that I see it, and I think we have always seen it, is that our role is data, and our role is transforming data into information. Often the folks who are collecting and or providing that is not their primary role. So I really think it's incumbent upon us to help translate in whatever way is necessary from their space to ours so that we can accomplish that mission. So we're very much in a service-oriented mindset when it comes to that. There's a lot of practicality there that does take time. I think that's a really important element of what you mentioned, Marianne, but I think it is cultural as much as anything. So I appreciate that part of the question. And yeah, it just does take time. It takes consistent outreach and the acceptance that this is a people business and the technology just happens to be a part of it.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Marianne. You have both been incredible fonts of insight today, so really appreciate you taking the time to join us. I am now going to hand over to Brennan to close us up for today.
Okay, I really want to do that, but also someone just asked a question about AI, and since that's everyone's question always now, I feel like we would be remiss to not get Matt and Marianne's quick insights on if how at all you're incorporating AI. And I will say the thing we always say at DQC, you may be feeling that policy pressure to do AI. You cannot just stick AI on top of data that's not high quality, useful, and expect it to garner insights that you can't already. But now I'm going to turn over to the people who actually know how to unpack that question.
I don't well, I don't know. You might have to find someone else if you want someone who really knows how to do it. I mean, I've just had a long conversation about this on Friday, so this is actually timely. The first thing I want to say is I think that in the context of public data, this question right now is more philosophical than strategic or technical. I really do think we have to grapple with um, the appropriateness and or appropriate ways of implementing AI in the context of public data. So that's a big, broad statement, but I do think it's sort of at that core level. In terms of practical application, we are really in an exploratory phase of what might be possible. We have created some synthetic data sets to explore what different applications might be effective or not. If I had to fast forward and guess where you might see us sort of dabble with some AI application, it would probably be on a relatively smaller scale, something like a user interface chatbot with our pre-aggregated publicly available data, public access files on our dashboards. Something like that is probably a place we would start. Broad scale adoption of AI. There is so much to grapple with, again, at the philosophical level, but also from the policy perspective. I think any decision we make within KY Stats shouldn't be done in our silo. Number one, it has to involve our partners that we've talked about today, but it's probably a broader statewide policy issue. So I wouldn't want to engage in any decisions absent of that.
Okay, now it's my turn to say ditto to what Matt said. I would say the two things I just underline is definitely at the exploratory stage. And the term AI is a broad term. We've used machine learning in different ways, but I think the question was likely about LLMs. So we're definitely at the exploratory phase. And as Matt also highlighted, we will not make decisions about AI without it being a part of the public governance process and in partnership with the state and with our partners on that.
I, thank you, Marianne and Matt. That in some ways to me is such a perfect example of why we say why governance, why this transparent leadership, why this shared decision-making table. That is, you have something new coming along that has a really public face and really mixed perceptions about what we should be doing with it. That needs to be an open public conversation about what states are doing with your data, with individuals' data, and this new technology. So thank you very much. Um, Angela, I think I have a closing slide. As she's pulling it up, I sort of said at the top, there's a reason we often highlight Matt and Marianne, Kentucky and California, both because we like these two people, but as you heard, they speak from such authentic, applicable experience. And the reason, Matt was saying, Brennan, you alluded to this, is because we took our best practices from what they were doing and said these are the kinds of state actions that we would love to see, domino effect and fall over all over the country. And so just thinking through these next steps, someone asked in the Q&A, what if you're not at the legislation phase? What can you do? And there's so much you can do. And Matt said it, I always say you don't get to KY stats when you adjourn sine die anyway. It's not like you just pass a bill and you've got it, right? There is that coalition of the willing, the table setting, having the conversations, having the meetings, finding your external critical friends who can keep that pressure on. That can be a really long on-ramp to being able to get to where Kentucky and now California are. But if you are lacking governance, you can take legislative action. You can at very least do the policymaker education. If you have questions about what those conversations and talking points look like, DQC, we're here to help with that. If you have elements of governance in place already, maybe you have the executive order approach, as Matt said, maybe you know that meeting is happening, but it's sort of behind closed doors. Are there ways to strengthen it? Are there ways to, Marianne talked about those use cases and those policy priorities. Can you align it more strongly with the things that you're trying to accomplish in your state? And if you already have a best practices cross-agency data governance, if you've got a Marianne, if you've got, we have hold leaders accountable here, but I like to say even better, be a critical friend, capital F, lowercase c, providing that pressure of like, hey, let's keep moving. Let's make sure we're thinking more broad. What's the innovation? Where can we go next? But also providing air cover when state leaders are having successes and making tough decisions. This is 3 bullet points. It makes it sound easy. We know that it's not. It's a very long runway. There was a reason that for many years, Maryland, Washington, Kentucky were the only states that had this, but we're seeing more and more states see state leaders, state legislators see that this really is a solution and a strong solution to sustainability and transparency for their data ecosystem. So thank you so much to Matt and Marianne. As always, thank you to all of you for joining today and providing thoughtful questions. Matt and Marianne generously offered their contact information. You can see Team DQCs here as well. And if we can answer things further for you or share any further resources, please do not hesitate to reach out.
And just as one last note, I know Brennan mentioned earlier that DQC has a new Data 101 resource. I am dropping the link. It literally came out just before our webinar today, so I am so excited to be able to share with folks. Please take a look at that link. And thank you again so sincerely to Matt Berry and Marianne Bates for joining us today, sharing your expertise and your wisdom. Brennan and Ted, thank you so much as always. And thank you everyone for your patience as we learned new things about Zoom today. Really appreciate y'all. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much for joining us.